Now, Brian, let's talk about this Kremlin list. I'm just introduced to my viewers, just a backgrounder, how it has been published and who is in there. Some couple of names, including 3 Armenians, end up being in the list, which in some cases, some of them maybe be proudly saying that, you know, we are in the Kremlin list. And, you know, what do you think? What is the significance of this list?
Well, actually, I break with the conventional wisdom on this, Harry. I mean, the initial reaction to the list among Kremlin watchers was almost to ridicule it. They said it was kind of like a cut and paste job from the Kremlin website. It copied the Forbes list. It's a phone book of Russian officials. There were some people who are close to the Kremlin who weren't on the list, and some people who aren't close to the Kremlin, and some who are even opposition to the Kremlin who are on the list. And certainly there was, you know, there seems to have been a bit of wrangling between the administration and Congress over this, and so.
And there were maybe some behind-the-scene lobbying efforts not to include someone.
Well, there was definitely some heavy lobbying by Russian officials to stay off the list, but I don't think that's what resulted in what we saw. But nevertheless, I actually think if you step back and look at this list and you look at it not as a singular event all by itself, but as part of a larger process, it's actually quite important. Yeah. It's more important than the specifics of who's on the list and who's not on the list. The fact of a list like this, the fact that Congress mandated a list like this by law, is part of a larger process that's saying it's the end of an era. The era where Russian officials and oligarchs can accumulate their money in a corrupt oligarchic system and then stash their money in the safe harbors of the West where it's protected by the rule of law. The era where Russia could try to overturn the rules-based Western international order and then keep their assets protected by the rules-based international order. Well, that era is clearly coming to an end. They were able to have it both ways for a long time. And to me, the larger significance of this list, beyond who's on it, who's not on it, whether it's a copy of the Forbes list or not, whether it's a cut and paste job from the Kremlin website or not, I think the fact of this list is actually very important for that reason. It's sending a message to the Russian elite. And I think it's very significant also that you have liberals on this list, like people like Arkady Dvorkovich or Dmitry Medvedev are considered liberals, right? As well as hardliners like Sechin and others. It's a message also that everybody who benefits from this regime is complicit in the behavior of this regime and is potentially liable for the behavior of this regime. So you can't get away with saying anymore, oh, I'm a Russian liberal, I'm a technocrat, I'm not really, you know, I don't really agree with all this, but at the same time you're benefiting from the regime. Well, you're just as liable as somebody who's a hardliner. So I think this is important for that reason. Can
you describe it as a smart sanctions or potential?
Well, I think the thing we got to remember is
smart list, something, you know.
The initial reactions to this list was like anything but that.
The sanctions in waiting, like anytime.
Yeah, this is not sanctions. No, I mean, the people on this list, except for the 22 officials who were already under sanctions, who are also on the list. This isn't a sanctions list. But what it does say is every single person on this list, and some people who aren't on this list. Because remember, there's a classified portion to this that we haven't seen. I don't have security clearance. I don't think you have security clearance. We haven't seen the classified portion. But there's a classified portion. So every single person on this list, and some people who aren't on it are beginning to wonder, can I get a visa? Can I open a Western bank account?
That's pretty significant.
Western banks who are doing business with a lot of these oligarchs are thinking, do I really want to associate myself with somebody on this list?
They should think twice before doing business with these people, right?
Yeah, so it's having a serious effect that way. I think it's I mean, the anticipation of this list, people were very nervous in Moscow about this.
But what do you think? For example, Russians are claiming now this is Americans are trying to influence our elections, as they were saying, as Americans were accusing Russians of influencing U.S. elections, attempting. Now, what do you say about that?
Well,
it will have an impact.
I think
not?
Anybody that knows anything about Russia knows that Russian elections are not elections. So therefore, no matter what the United States or anybody else does, and I do not think this is an attempt to influence the elections, but even if it were, Russian elections aren't elections. The Kremlin gets the result they want. They're stage managed affairs. So it's just, on the face of it, it's just an absurd claim. Right?
But the other thing is that, for example, these people that are, appeared in this list, they should now think really hard. Is it what we should be doing in the future? Should we be so closely associated with Vladimir Putin, or should we start, diversifying our investments outside of the country? Should we be moving our assets?
Yeah,
is that the intention of this
I don't know
list,
if that's
maybe?
the intention. It might be the result. Because, I mean, I was reading in advance of this list that Russian oligarchs were like trying to get themselves removed from photographs with Vladimir Putin, right? So this is, I mean, which is a very interesting thing. There was heavy lobbying to not get on the list. And what I think this is doing is it will accelerate a process that's already been going on. And that is what I consider the separation of the collective Putin from Putin the man. The separation of the Putin system from Putin himself. And I think this is tied up in all sorts of things. There's a growing consensus in Moscow that this is going to be Putin's last term as president. There's all sorts of speculation that he'll find some way to remain in power outside the context of the presidency. Even one report even said there's going to be an attempt to create something like a Russian Ayatollah. There's been reports in the, meaning the supreme leader, not necessarily a religious leader, but there's been reports in the Russian media that they may revive the Государственный Совет, the state council, and have a Chinese model of leadership that would be above the president himself. So there's all these, but it doesn't matter because all that does is put off the inevitable. Putin's 65 years old. Right? When this term as president ends, he's going to be over 70. The man can take his shirt off and ride a horse all he wants. He's mortal just like you and I.
Yeah.
And so the senior figures in the system are beginning to become aware of this.
Except the fact that some people in Russia claim that he has this, Bloodcurdling gene. Blockade.
I've read the different, kind of, quite frankly, ridiculous accounts that, he's going to rule until he's well over 100 and so on. No, the man's mortal. And I think there is a growing realization among the elite that the system is going to want to preserve itself beyond Putin. Now, that doesn't mean Russia's going to turn democratic or liberal.
But
they have to think about not just a successor, but they have to think about life after Putin. And things like this are going to accelerate that process. So I think that's also a significance. Again,
we're dealing now with close to 1 trillion wealth here in this list, right? If you add up everything, that everyone has it at over 100 billion.
Yeah, I haven't done the math, but
maybe
that sounds about right. But I mean, this is an example of that everybody in this system is now complicit, and they're going to have to start. People are going to start thinking twice. Do they want to be part of this?
I know, but there's another side of this. Some people would proudly really showcase themselves that, you see, we are in the list, and Medvedev said, this is a compelling reason, for if you are not on the list, to resign, to think about resigning from your job.
Well, no, I think there's a lot of bravado about this. Of course, people are going to say they're proud of it, but I can tell you for sure the people on this list that have assets in the West, and there are a lot of them, are very worried about the fate of their assets.
they've been frozen, right?
Well, yeah, and again, I mean, Russian officials love to criticize the West, but they also love to send their kids to Western schools.
Yeah,
they love to put their money in Western banks. They love to buy, you know, fancy apartments in London and Paris, in the south of France. So this again
they're
is
sending their kids to live in democracies, but
well, again, just like you accumulate your money in a kleptocracy and you stash it where the rule of law is. Now this is a signal you can't have it both ways anymore. If you want access to the West's safe harbors, you have to abide by the West's rules. Right? I mean, my money's in West. I don't have as much money as these people, but my money's in Western banks, and I abide by Western rules. Right? This is how it is. Russian officials have been able to have it both ways for a very long time, and they're not going to be able to. And this is a signal. And again, looking at this list in isolation, looking at the minutiae of who's on it and who's not, I think is a mistake. I think you have to step back and look at this list as part of a larger, broader process that's going on. This is not the end point of something. It's one point in a process that's been going on for a while.
And you've been following Kremlin, watching Kremlin very closely, but you also be watching Russian society. And as you see, you can see new generation of people that are emerging with this Navalny tide and takes over these hearts and minds of this younger generation. What do you think about that?
Well, think about it this way.
So lost, you know, everything is lost in Russia, or you think that
I don't think everything's
the generation
lost, but I think
is really coming up is very strong and might bring changes?
Well, think about it this way. If somebody was born the day Putin became acting president of the Russian Federation in you know, New Year's Eve, 1999 to 2000, somebody that was born at that time, they'll be now voting in their very first election. Right? They're 18 years old now. They'll be voting in their very first election, and they have known no other leader but Putin, and no, Medvedev doesn't count. Okay. Now think about this. When I was born, it was 1963. John F. Kennedy was president of the United States when I was born. When I cast my first ballot in a presidential election in the United States, Ronald Reagan was president. Think of how many presidents we had. We had Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, 6 presidents. Think about how much the United States politics changed from 1963, when I was born, to 1981. I actually cast my first ballot in '82, which was the midterm elections, and the first time in a presidential election in '84. But nevertheless, when I was 18, the country had changed dramatically. If you're 18 in Russia, you knew only one president. And people, I think there's a generation that's growing that's getting kind of tired of this. They want something different. They want a new product.
These are the kids that are tech savvy, and we know Russians like technology. They're very good at it, and they are on YouTube.
It's also important that they're the
every
first generation.
Platform that is available now on social media.
And they're also the first generation that not only doesn't remember the Soviet Union, they don't remember the chaotic post-Soviet period of the 90s. They don't remember that. They weren't born yet, right? So they're not susceptible to Putin's stories. Putin's telling the story that he's lifted Russia off its knees, he's saved Russia from the chaos of the 90s, and so on. That story doesn't resonate with these young people anymore.
And the Russian liberal thinking, the progressives, they are always stable portion of society, and they are always there, but they are very strong, and they have their beliefs.
They're resilient. They continue. It's always a very small.
They're in tough situation now, but it's still.
But I think what's important here is this generation isn't really buying Putin's stories anymore. But Navalny's telling a very compelling story to these kids. He's saying, they've been telling us we can't live like Europeans. Well, yes, we can. They're telling us we can't have an honest government. Yes, we can. Now, whether or not Navalny follows through on this, if and when he ever, gets power, and that's a big if and a big when, I think that the story he's telling is actually quite compelling. It's actually quite compelling for
and appealing to the younger generation, right?
So and I think so. You have this new generation that's coming of age right now. Now, bear in mind, we've been fooled before in the generation thing, right? I mean, remember when the post-Stalin generation of the Soviet Union was supposed to bring about change? To a degree it did, because that was the Gorbachev generation, right?
Exactly.
Around the time of the Bolotnaya protests in 2011, there was talk of the first generation that kind of doesn't remember the Soviet Union, and we were expecting big change. It didn't happen, right? In fact, we had kind of regression. And now we have this kind of post-Soviet generation coming around, the 18-year-olds who will be voting for the first time in this election, or maybe not voting if they listen.
And by the way, this younger generation, they are not necessarily pro-Western.
Not necessarily, no.
They are very patriotic as their, elders are, right?
No, and this is why
But
Navalny,
they want changes.
They want change. Navalny has touched on something. You notice Navalny doesn't say a lot about foreign affairs.
No.
He doesn't say a lot about Crimea or Ukraine or the West even. He talks about corruption. He talks about the crooks and the thieves that are stealing your money. And this resonates. So he's very cleverly sticking to an issue that matters. But yeah, this generation, remember, Navalny has some nationalist tendencies. And so and that resonates with a lot of these younger people.
And the other question is that Putin, when commenting on this Kremlin list, he said, this is stupid. It turns our relations into zero, and we're trying to build our relationship passionately as much as the other side wants. What do you say about this? Are they really interested in improving relations with America?
They're interested in improving relations with America without changing anything they're doing.
Yeah.
This Kremlin looks at improving relations with America and the West in general as Russia can do whatever it wants, and the West goes along with that. But, annexing another country's territory is not acceptable to the West. Hacking another country's election is not acceptable to the West, right? So,
what do you think will happen after Putin, as you believe, will be elected, will do after his re-election? What do you think? Is he going to continue this policies in near abroad, as they call it, aggressive?
I would think yes.
Policy.
I would think yes for a number of reasons. The regime's legitimacy is so tied up into this, right? If you think of the Putin social contract, when he first came to power in 2000, he basically offered, I will give you stability and prosperity, you give up a lot of your freedom, right? Now, the new social contract he offered post-Crimea is, all right, well, you give up that prosperity as well as your freedom, and I'll give you an empire. So all he's got now is the pretense of empire. So I just have a very hard time seeing how they will be able to back off on Ukraine, on Georgia, on Transnistria. And so I really don't, and I honestly don't think that Putin and his closest associates view these countries, including Armenia, as truly independent states.
I was going to ask
as truly independent states.
Armenia.
I don't think they believe these are independent states.
Armenia has very large community in the States. You're American, you know that perfectly well. And, they're well positioned to use this lobbying arm in the States to further their cases in Washington, right?
Yeah.
But they're doing sometimes. But on the other hand, you see Russia is so closely, associated with Armenia. It's so pushing hard on some, foreign policy matters that Armenia is not able even vote at the United Nations independently. Armenia goes always with Russia, But on the other hand, we see that the president is Armenia is trying to get closer also to Europe. As we saw last year, they signed this EU agreement with the EU, which is a lighter version.
It's a lighter version of the association.
But it's again, it's pretty significant for Armenia. What do you think about that? Does Armenia has a chance, any chance to, somehow to cut itself from?
I guess what I'm saying, maybe some of your viewers may not like, but I think Russia, due to the current geopolitical situation, Russia has a lot of leverage over Armenia because of Karabakh, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, really. I mean, Russia is in the minds of a lot of analysts, and again, I'm not an Armenia specialist or a Karabakh specialist, but in the minds of a lot of analysts, if you remove that Russian support there, the equation would change dramatically and not change in Armenia's favor. And Russia knows this, and Armenia knows this, and Russia knows that Armenia knows this. And as a result, the Kremlin has a lot of leverage.
But on the other hand, we see
now,
that
whether that's good or bad, I'll leave that to people to decide for themselves. But that is, I mean, that is how, and again, not being an expert on Armenia and these, but looking at it that way, I mean, I've listened to a lot of experts on this. That gives Russia a lot of leverage, a lot of leverage.
But right now we're witnessing the huge arms sales in favor of Azerbaijan.
Yeah,
they're selling a lot of.
Well, they're selling them at market prices.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
That's a little bit. That's a little different.
Yeah,
right?
Russia is the only country in OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs chairmanship that is selling weapons to both sides.
Yeah, yeah. Russia's selling weapons to both sides.
No other country is doing that.
It's selling them a lot cheaper to Armenia.
Yeah.
Right. But again, this gives. But see that they're not fools in the Kremlin. They know this gives them leverage. They look at each of the former Soviet states and see, where do we have leverage here? What can we use for leverage? And they use all sorts of things. They use oligarchs, right? That's what they historically used in Ukraine, right? They use the Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine, and they attempt to use it in the Baltic states, less successfully. But they use all of these things, everything that they can use to leverage any of their neighbors, to make sure that that neighbor doesn't stray out of Moscow's sphere of influence. They're going to use it. They're going to use it. So so I mean, Armenia is much like the rest of Russia's neighbors in this sense, although it has this.
And what's going to happen with Georgia? Are you predicting you know, strengthening Russia's influence in Georgia as well, or not, or?
It's hard to say. I mean, I've seen not a strengthening of Russia's influence in Georgia, but a realization, I mean, a lot in Georgia, that the longer Georgia has to be waiting at the doorstep to try to get into Western institutions, the more the population is going to begin to think that this fight isn't really worth it, right? That's the tragic situation about Georgia.
Very soon we will see you in Washington working for some major think tanks there. What will be your area of interest there?
Well, I'll be joining the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington as a senior fellow and as the director of their newly formed Russia program. Now, this think tank exists effectively to keep the Baltic states and the Visegrad Four European states on the U.S. agenda, pretty much. That's really the reason. And they're creating a new Russia program, because when you think, what's the biggest threat to these countries? Well, it's obvious.
But you will be also,
Russia.
You know, researching our areas as well, right?
Yeah, of course. I'll continue to be looking at Russia's domestic politics, Russia's foreign affairs, Russia's relations with its neighbors. I'll still be doing all those kinds of things.
I'm hoping that you will be our frequent guest.
I'll be glad to be your frequent guest.
Thank you,
Brian.
Brian.
Thank you, Harry.